The old Army green pickup truck rolled slowly down the winding curves of Highway 50, leaving behind a faint trail of dust, as if it carried the echoes of a distant battlefield. The man behind the wheel had sun-baked skin, sharp eyes like razors, silver hair cut short in regulation style, and a worn-out bomber jacket that still bore the faded emblem of the United States Air Force just over his left chest. That man was Harold Anderson, a retired fighter pilot who once flew the mighty F-15 Thunder during the Vietnam War. A man whose blood would stir at the sound of jet engines roaring overhead like a young recruit ready for combat. Harold was on his way from his small farm outside of Kansas to an old Air Force base where a reunion was taking place today for veterans of the Air Corps, men who had once shared cans of cold beans, torn cigarettes, and minutes that counted for a lifetime in the skies over Saigon during a time when every takeoff was a question mark, and every landing was a blessing. In the cab of his truck, an old AM radio crackled out the raspy voice of Creedence Clearwater Revival, playing Fortunate Son. The guitar riff sliced through time like a jet slicing the clouds. His right hand gripped the steering wheel while his left occasionally adjusted the aviator sunglasses he had worn since the war. As he reached the empty stretch of road between two towns called Elwood and Junction City, where the fields ran wide as oceans and broken power poles cast long shadows on the highway, he tapped the gas pedal just a little. The instinct of a fighter pilot, who once flew at Mach 2, did not allow him to crawl along like some 73-year-old retiree. Moments later, the sound of a police siren pierced the calm, and flashing red and blue lights lit up in his rearview mirror. Harold furrowed his brow and calmly pulled over to the side, reaching into the glove box for his old leather wallet, eyes still fixed on the mirror, watching a young highway patrol officer step out of his cruiser with deliberate, steady steps. The officer, a tall white man in his 30s, buzz-cut, clean glasses, like someone straight off a TV series, approached and knocked on the window. Harold rolled it down, revealing cold steel eyes behind dark shades. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Officer Carson, Kansas Highway Patrol. You were clocked doing nearly 70 in a 55 zone. I need to see your driver's license and registration, please." Harold didn't answer right away. He stared at the man in front of him, then slowly pulled out a worn ID card from his wallet, held it up to the sunlight, and said with a gravelly voice, like the hum of a jet engine winding down, "I don't have a valid driver's license. Haven't renewed it since '99. But I do have a license to fly the F-15 Thunder, and if you know what that is, you'll know I didn't get it by accident." Carson squinted at the ID, then back at the old man. The man before him looked like he had walked out of an Air Force museum, the voice, the posture, the gaze filled with challenge and calm at the same time. The card clearly said Harold J. Anderson, Captain, United States Air Force, service number intact, a faded Department of Defense stamp across the back, but no sign of any civilian driver credentials. "You say you flew the F-15 for real?" the officer asked, still keeping his professional tone, though clearly rattled. "Where did you serve?" Harold smiled a crooked smile, tilted his head back, and looked up to the sky like he could still see the cloud layers over Southeast Asia in '69, where he had once flown nap of the Earth missions to save trapped squadrons from SAM missile ambushes. "I flew in Pleiku, in Da Nang, anywhere my boys were stuck. I took off in the dark and landed without lights. I turned my jet around when the radar screamed I was being locked from behind. I squeezed the trigger when the distance was 500 meters, and I flew through the edge between life and death at least 32 times before I ever saw American soil again in '72. The officer swallowed. He didn't know what to say. This wasn't in the manual. There was no chapter for what to do when an old man without a license claimed to be a decorated war pilot and was probably telling the truth. "Sir, I'm going to have to verify your identity and the registration. Please remain in your vehicle," Carson said, then turned back to his cruiser to call in the plates, eyes still flicking toward the mirror where that man sat like a statue behind the wheel, sunlight cutting across his shoulder, revealing the pilot patch and those eyes still watching every move like a commander surveying the battlefield. Meanwhile, Harold exhaled softly. He was used to suspicion. He was used to eyes that didn't believe. He never asked for understanding, but sometimes he wished someone remembered that in those skies, there were men who had lived like moths to flame and returned like ghosts. He knew rules had to be followed, but he also knew there were things beyond rules, things like honor, things like loyalty, and things like the memory of brothers who never came home. A thought drifted across his mind. It had been a long time since anyone called him captain, a long time since he smelled the sharp oil of jet fuel or felt the wind press against the canopy. But today, here on this road, in this old truck, with this young officer verifying an old ID, and the wind slicing across the tall grass, he felt like he was still flying, still fighting, still alive in a piece of sky that never truly let him go. The western sky was drenched in gold, like the rotor blades of dusty helicopters from long ago. The Kansas fields lay quiet, like an abandoned landing zone, and time itself felt like it was waiting for a door to open. From the deepest corners of Harold's mind, the wind whispered through the cracked truck window, mingling with the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. A part of him was still flying, still gripping the stick with calloused hands, still calculating bank angles through flak and rain above the jungles of Vietnam. And while the young officer was checking his patrol car systems, Harold remained silent, his eyes scanning the power lines, the tire tracks on the pavement, as if still watching terrain for signs of enemy movement. In that moment, he remembered a June night in '70, when he was called up during an emergency rotation. The F-15 was still hot from its last sortie when his squadmates rushed in with news. A Marine platoon was ambushed across the Perfume River, and no one could reach them in time but him. He disobeyed a direct order, not out of rebellion, but because in that moment, time was the enemy more than any rifle. Harold flew without radar, without air support. He sliced through cloud layers like a blade cutting the sky straight to the coordinates, and when he came back, the left wing of his jet had a gaping hole, but his heart was more intact than it had ever been. Back in the present, the static from the patrol car radio crackled and then fell silent. The officer stepped out again. Something had changed in his face. The firmness from earlier had faded. Now he looked like a man who had just heard something hard to believe. He nodded slowly, walking toward Harold's window, his voice lower than before. "Mr. Anderson, please stay here a few more minutes. I've verified some information, and I've called my superiors. I think you'll want to meet them." Harold gave a faint smile, his hands still resting on the wheel as if nothing was out of place, but inside, every combat instinct had come alive again. He had seen that look in young soldiers during the war, when they witnessed a legend step into the trench, bringing with them the winds of something greater. 5 minutes later, the sound came rolling in, familiar enough to make his chest ache, the diesel engines of Humvees, heavy tires grinding pavement, and military radio chatter cutting into civilian frequencies. Harold turned and looked through the rearview mirror. 4 military vehicles approached in formation, like entering a combat zone, and even the officers stepped back, standing at attention like awaiting an inspection. The first Humvee door swung open, and out stepped a man in full tactical uniform, insignia glinting, 4 stars on his chest, the ultimate symbol of military command. Harold squinted. The moment hung suspended like a still frame from a war documentary. The man was tall, his eyes hardened like tempered steel, shaped by a dozen operations. His hair was short, graying, his voice deep enough to echo across any base. "Dad." Harold didn't speak right away. He tilted his head, as if admiring a piece of history, not just a general, but his son, General Curtis Anderson, commander of United States Air Combat Command, a man who had led thousands in campaigns across Iraq and Syria and who was once a boy waiting by the window of a wooden house in Texas for his father to return from another unnamed mission in '73. Curtis stepped up, removed his gloves, and saluted with formality before embracing Harold like wrapping both the past and present in one breath. "I got a report about an old pilot being pulled over for not having a driver's license. I didn't believe it until they read your name." Harold smiled softly, his eyes a little red, but his gaze sharp as ever. "I told them I didn't have a driver's license, only a license to fly warplanes, but apparently that doesn't mean much anymore." Curtis turned to the officer and the soldiers, his voice clear as a tactical briefing. "This is Harold J. Anderson, former Air Force Captain, 3rd Squadron Air Command, Vietnam Campaigns, 71 to 72, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Flying Cross. Does anyone here question the honor of this man? I will personally request an official apology from the department if so." The entire area was silent. A young private stepped forward, eyes wide like meeting a hero from a history book. "Sir, were you the one who downed the MiG-21 in the battle near Qua Viet?" Harold nodded slowly. "That year, I spotted it low in the clouds, under 3,000 feet. No radar, no target lock, just instinct and the memory of brothers waiting for cover fire below." The officer stepped forward and bowed slightly. "I apologize, Mr. Anderson. I didn't know. I was just following procedure." Harold looked at him, placing a hand on his shoulder with the kind of firm gentleness only war-hardened leaders possess. "You did your job, son. Nothing to be sorry for. We all just fly our own maps." Curtis turned back to his father and said, "My truck is full of gas, and there's no speed limit on memory. I think you should ride with us, formation escort back to the old base where your squad mates are waiting." Harold nodded, his eyes lit up like the cockpit lights of his youth. He stepped out of his pickup, standing tall once more, saluting his son before climbing into the military vehicle amidst a chorus of salutes. As the convoy rolled out, the quiet highway became the opening notes of a grand march, not for speed, not for sirens, but for the story carried behind the wheel of a man who never stopped flying, not in the sky and not in his soul. The evening sun stretched long across the abandoned runway, like the final rays of a glorious era. The rumble of military wheels rolled slowly over the faded asphalt, where once hundreds of sorties had launched into dense forests and endless skies. Harold sat in the back of the Humvee, feeling as though time itself had collapsed into a spiral, like the swirls of air in a cockpit. Every foot forward was a year of youth returning, another sealed memory unfolding like a mission map carefully folded after combat. This place once bore the codename Firebase Liberty, a forward outpost between the safe zone and the killing fields, where Steel Eagles were refueled, loaded with missiles and conviction, before vanishing into the storm of fire. There were nights when entire squadrons went dark in flare storms, days when the ammo bunker was nearly empty, but the radio still called out the final message: no one backed down. When the vehicle stopped, its tires crackling softly on red dust, Harold stepped out, his boots still stained with hardened mud. He stood upright despite the surgeries on his spine. His eyes scanned the command building, its concrete walls chipped and worn, but the memories within still intact, like they were just written that morning. From the far side of the runway came footsteps and the metallic tap of canes echoing on concrete. Then, one by one, the shapes appeared, bent backs, silver hair, deep eyes, each man wearing his old flight jacket or frayed boonie hat. Harold recognized Larry, the mechanic from Louisiana, who once broke the cockpit lock to pull him out of a burning jet. He saw Frankie, his bunkmate, who used to write letters home with colored pencils, and Marcus, who carried a wounded man across 300 yards of open fire just to save a single life. The veterans didn't salute. They approached with silent embraces, with eyes carrying the weight of years in silence, because in war, few words matter. Men live by action and die without sound. General Curtis stepped back, standing beside the young officers, giving space to those who had earned it with fire and blood. He whispered, just loud enough for them to hear, Look at them. Those are the ones who lived in real trenches, who fought not with numbers but with their whole hearts. They are the reason we exist today. Harold walked into the old command center, where a wooden mission board still hung with names etched by hand, his name among them, next to others who never came back. He raised his hand, brushing across the letters as if sinking again with each breath once drawn in that cockpit. He spoke of his final mission, the day he flew deep into occupied territory to rescue a medical team ambushed without air cover or support. He had to land in a burning rice field and carry each medic onto his damaged aircraft, then launch skyward with one engine smoking like a dying torch. The room was silent as he named the ones who didn't return, each name carved into memory, not into marble. No ceremony, just courage. He recounted each battle as if it happened that morning, the vibration of a hit fuselage, the silence when radar cut out, the soldiers covered in grime but with eyes shining, ready to die so their brothers could live. Harold turned to Curtis, his son, once a boy afraid every day his father wouldn't return, a man who followed not to imitate but to honor. Harold nodded, a silent signal of trust and legacy. Curtis stepped forward, pulling from his jacket a yellowed ID card, long forgotten. I found this in the classified archives back when I served as deputy commander. Nobody knew it still existed, but I knew it belonged in your hands. Harold took the card and pulled from his own coat an old silver badge, faded at the edges. It was the pilot wings he received on his first mission day. He handed it to Curtis, a legacy wordless but thunderous. The flags began to fly. The wind from the runway carried the echo of a song not played by instruments or brass, just the aged voices of men whose memories had not faded. They sang without harmony, but with truth, with breath shaped by war and love and loss. At the ceremony's end, Harold stood before the young soldiers, raising his hand not in salute, but to tell a story, short and sharp, like the crack of a shot, a story once told to him by a dying Marine in his arms. When you see the flag flying, don't think of victory first. Think of the ones who fell so it could fly. Live in a way that honors that sacrifice. The entire base stood silent, every soldier upright, eyes forward, not from command but from pride. An old day had returned. A generation thought forgotten had risen from the dust, and in that moment, Harold Anderson was no longer an old man without a driver's license. He was a living symbol of a time no one could replicate, a soldier who had lived and died 100 times in the heart of America. That morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still dim, but he had already put on his old uniform, crisp and neatly pressed. The silver wings were still pinned over his heart, right where it used to race inside the cockpit whenever the radar lit up with incoming enemy fire. The sound of military wheels echoed outside. He stepped out, boots heavy with time, but his back still straight. His eyes carried a light no one could quite name, but every combat veteran understood. It was the look of a man who still had a mission. General Curtis was already waiting outside. No words were exchanged, only a nod, and that was enough. They both understood today was not just another day. They were headed to a ceremony not listed on any official schedule, but one organized by silent orders passed between those who knew what true sacrifice looked like. On the road to the Pentagon, the Humvee glided down long avenues, the wind brushing against the half-open window, like it too was saluting a man returning from a war long past. When they arrived, they didn't stop at the main entrance. They went straight to a side door, one reserved for high-ranking officers and ghosts. Inside was a small room, four walls lined with relics of war, hand-drawn maps from Southeast Asia, broken aircraft parts sealed in glass, and at the center, a wooden table with only one small box on it, wrapped in red silk. General Curtis turned to his father and spoke in a low voice, like addressing history itself. Today, there will be no speech, no press, no applause, because real sacrifice does not need an audience, only remembrance by the right people. Harold stepped forward and opened the box. Inside was a medal with no name, no description, no emblem, just a dull bronze shape with a faint date etched on the back, the day of his final mission. He held it in his hands. They trembled, not from age, but from the flood of images pouring back into his mind, the radio screaming for help, the engine gasping on one prop, the soldier's eyes as he lifted him aboard, the man who died days later from infection but smiled and whispered thanks before closing his eyes forever. Harold didn't cry, but General Curtis saw the light in his eyes flicker. He placed the medal over his chest, not pinned, just laid there like it had always been part of him, and turned to walk out. No salute, no fanfare, because real soldiers leave in silence, but their echo remains. Instead of heading home, they turned into Arlington National Cemetery, where over 400,000 white headstones stood in silent formation. Harold walked through the rows, stopped at one marked Frankie, the friend who used to write home in colored pencil. He pulled from his pocket a weathered letter, read each line again, then folded it and placed it on the grave. No goodbyes were spoken, because between true warriors, parting is never final. General Curtis stood a distance away, giving space, knowing there are wounds that never heal, but those wounds are proof that someone lived, loved, fought, and never ran. A few weeks after their return, Harold received a sealed letter from the office of the president. Inside was no ceremony, just a handwritten card. Mr. Anderson, we know you never cared for medals, but this country would not exist without men like you. Thank you for flying when there was no guarantee you'd return. Signed in strong pen strokes, like the one writing was standing at attention. Harold folded the card gently, placed it beside an old photo of his squadron, then stepped out back where he had raised the flag from Firebase Liberty. Though faded and weathered, it still flew high, like the beat of his heart for an old mission. He stood there for a long time, not searching for anything, just out of habit of a man who had flown thousands of hours, always scanning, always watching. And then, from behind, came footsteps, soft and familiar. It was Curtis with 2 cups of black coffee, no sugar. He handed one to his father, then sat down beside him. Neither spoke, both stared into the sky, like 2 soldiers keeping watch over a dawn that belonged to no one. And that was how another day began, in silence and meaning, just like the life of Harold Anderson, the man who once was asked for a driver's license, but who never truly landed.